Good morning, everyone. My name is Keshava, if we haven't yet had the pleasure of meeting, and I want to begin with a little bit of a story. So for those of you who don't know, I grew up playing the cello, and it was a very simple karma that brought me to that, which was that I had the good fortune of moving next door to a master cellist. My older brother, by 2 years, heard him play and harassed our parents until he was allowed to pick it up himself. And then perhaps one part out of fear of missing out and one part out of genuine inspiration, I would always race home before my brother would get back from kindergarten, and I would play his cello before he would get there. And eventually, I too was allowed to become a cellist. And I remember on my 5th birthday, which was my first lesson, because my teacher wouldn't take me until I was 5. My first lesson was to learn how to pick up the cello and walk around his apartment. And thus concluded my first lesson as a cellist. And I was so proud of myself that I got to be a musician, and it became a real central area of my life for the next about 11 or 12 years. And just a few years after that, when I was 6 or 7 years old, I entered into my first competition. And as it happened, they dressed me up in my little fake tuxedo with my clip-on bow tie and, my shoes and socks that I don't put on correctly, and they wheel me out in front of some judges, classical musicians. Now, I have to just give a little bit of an asterisk here that Nevada City, where I grew up, despite having a minuscule population, the surrounding area actually has quite a vibrant classical music culture, because basically a lot of musicians and well-to-do people from San Francisco, upon retiring, go live there. And so there's quite a vibrant culture of music. And this organization had a music competition for children every year, which I competed in. And, a competition when you're 6 or 7 years old or when you're 67 years old can be very scary for the ego, because what if I'm not good enough? What if I fail? What if they don't like me? All of these various things. And I went in and I competed, and as it happened, I did well enough to merit a 2nd place victory that year. And I was very proud of myself, and mostly I was also very proud of the $75 check that I was given. And now, again, for context, I want to help remind all of us that for a 6-year-old in Northern California who was paid $0.25 an hour to pick up pine cones, $75 felt like an absolute windfall. I'm sitting there like, I'm big money now. And what am I going to do with so much power? And I wasn't yet a Spider-Man fan, so I didn't know that with great power comes great responsibility. And so I was sitting there and looking at this check and sort of marveling in the possibilities. I could buy a bicycle. I could buy ice cream. I don't know what to do with myself. And I had never handled that much power before, that much money. And I'm very grateful because, for those of you who don't know also, I grew up at Ananda Village. So I grew up in the custody of a whole community of yogis. And so the worldview which was imparted to me was one of God orientation in everything that we did. And so I remember very distinctly my mother, being afraid that I might lose the check or tear the check or something. I gave it to my mother for safekeeping. And then one day, just a few days after my competition, she sat me down, and I remember this so vividly. She was in her office. I sat down, she sat me down in front of her, and she said, "Now, Keshava, you've won $75, and all of that money is yours. And I'm going to go cash the check, and either I can give it to you in cash, or I can hold on to it for you, and you can spend it, and I'll keep track of it for you." She was walking me through how all that was going to work. But then she paused, and she said, "But before we go further, Keshava, I want you to reflect. Why did you win that competition?" And I said, "Well, I played well." She said, "That's right, you played well. And why did you play well?" And I said, "Well, I guess," and she was probably leading me on quite a bit more than this, so forgive my memory. But I was able to recognize I played well because I practiced. And I played well because I had a good teacher. But then, even then, I was able to recognize this. She said, "But what about the other kids whom you played against? Didn't they practice? Didn't they have teachers?" I said, "Yes." And she said, "So can you see that there's an additional part in here, which is that you had a talent. You have a gift for music. And where did that gift come from? And after searching my pockets for a moment, I realized I didn't have the answer for that. And then she said, of course, that your talent came from God. God gave you this ability with music, and you have used that ability to be able to win this money. And I thought, wow. And she then proposed a revolutionary idea to me. She said, so wouldn't it be appropriate for you to say thank you to God for giving you that talent? And I thought, that's a great idea. Thank you, God. And she said, but one of the ways that we say thank you to God is by tithing. What's tithing? And she said, when you're grateful to God for giving you the power to do something, sometimes you give back to God 10% of what he has given you. And I looked down. That's $7.50. And I mustered my courage, and she said, and she didn't force me, she said, would you like to try tithing some of your money? And I said, yes, I would. And so she counted out $7.50, and I put it in an envelope with my name on it, and I wrote, thank you, God, for the talent of music. And I took that envelope down to the Ananda Village Market, the mail room, where they collected donations and tithes every month. And at that time, they don't have it anymore, which I sort of lament because it was very charming. They had this enormous, very awkward, clumsy wooden box, which I think because it had been so hideous, somebody had painted it with these like big multicolored, like it was blue and had clouds and stars and all these sorts of beautiful, very like child appealing motifs on it. And in big gold letters, it said, thank you, God. It didn't say tithing or donations, it said, thank you, God. And I remember I was too short to even put the envelope in the opening. And so they had to pull over a little stepladder. And I climbed up the little stepladder with my envelope, and I stood in front of the box, and I held it, and I closed my eyes, and I said, thank you, God, for giving me the power to win this competition. And I put the money in the box. And now, of course, to the simple mind of a 6-year-old, I was giving that money to God. It really felt like that to me. And what was interesting is it set the precedent that from that year forward, I basically would win competitions at least once a year to an effect of what I considered at the time pretty serious money. And I never forgot that lesson. I would always give 10% of my victory very tangibly back to God because I knew that that talent was not really my own, but that it was given to me. And that it was mine to use responsibly and to remember from whence it came. Now, how does that pertain to our topic of the ego, friend or foe? Well, really, I think it's very simple. That the ego, as many of us know, Yogananda defined as that bundle of self-definitions which thinks of itself as being this body. And so the ego is really our greatest foe, so long as the direction that we're using it points us downward and away from the divine. But that if we can reverse that flow and our sense of self-identity begins to become increasingly Godward, then actually the expansion of the ego can take us to the very doorway of infinity. Now, another interesting thing that I'd like to try and connect in here with this lecture today is, I think for many of us on this path, especially those of us who have been around the block a few times, we've heard the expression that you should give it to God. Now, what it is can be a whole multitude of things. Perhaps it's your recent tragedy or your recent victory or your job or your troubles or your divorce or whatever it is that people say, well, just give it to God. And unless you're 6 years old and there's a box that says, thank you, God on it, most of us probably wonder, well, how am I supposed to do that? And then we think to ourselves, okay, well, tithing, that's easy. I just give 10% of my income to something which I believe is a channel of God in my life, not so hard. But how do you give your ego to God? How do you give your triumphs or your failures or your sorrows, your griefs? How do you give that to God? What's his mailing address? And what I'd like to propose is that maybe it's actually quite a bit easier than some of us realize. And that maybe giving something to God is having the flexibility to leave behind your past self-identities in the name of a greater victory to come. So I'll put it to you in this way. It's interesting, Yogananda said that actually that the small victories of childhood are very important for establishing self-confidence in life. And for example, I remember the first time I was tall enough to turn on the water faucet by myself and how proud I was of that. And so it's interesting that he says when raising children, you ought not to belittle those moments and, tell them, oh, it doesn't matter, you would have got tall eventually. But you should celebrate that, and you should help them, be confident in that victory. But wouldn't it be a mistake if, the only self-identity somebody had was the fact that they were the quarterback in high school? Don't we all recognize that as being very self-limiting? And that, for anybody who says, I peaked in high school, we all sort of cringe at that, right? It's a tragedy, actually. But that if a victory or if a success or if an experience in our life can become a doorway, a portal through which we perceive and become devoted to a greater expansion, then it's a doorway, it's a portal, it's a paving the way towards infinity. And so what's very interesting is if we're supposed to try and give everything to God, maybe a way to practicalize that is just to remember Swami's definition of what God is to that atheistic Australian. When Swamiji said, God is merely the highest version of yourself that you can possibly imagine. Isn't that beautiful to think of? And so what if ego transcendence is being willing to sacrifice in the fires of wisdom your past conceptions of who you think you are? I am the son of so-and-so, the person who has won music competitions, I have graduated in this year. Maybe it's being willing to sacrifice those towards the altar of what you think could be your highest potential. And now what's interesting is at first that of course might lead to ambition, that the cellist might say, I want to not just win at local competitions, I want to win at greater competitions. And of course that could lead to an inflated ego, but eventually we will begin to realize that which limits us is that sense of I. That in any art form, in any pursuit, what we begin to recognize is that no matter how beautifully I play the music, there's always this big block in the way, and it's that thing called I. And if only I could get rid of I and there was only music left, then I would have been victorious. And any musician or any artist, or dare I say anyone in any field who has progressed deep enough into their craft can recognize this. That actually self-forgetfulness is the doorway to perfection in any undertaking. And so then eventually we arrive at that place where we can no longer simply set the bar one step further by the standards of the measurable world. And we begin to become confused. And we ask ourselves, well, what next? Because every goal I set myself becomes rather a cage, something that binds, something that further defines. And where then is the door out? And to maybe illustrate this point, I'd like to tell my one story of getting to ask Swami Kriyananda a personal question in life. And I guess given my disposition as an artist, though I did not pursue music as a profession, I did decide to move into theater. And so at a young age, I went and enrolled in a college in Los Angeles. I became an actor. I was living there at the time when Swami Kriyananda was also in Los Angeles. And because of that, I had the opportunity of being in a number of satsangs with him at a few Sunday services. And there was one very intimate satsang that I was invited to with just a core group of devotees. And in that satsang, I had the opportunity to ask him a question, a very personal question in a close setting. And it was very interesting because I'll just relate the whole story because I think in it there's also a lesson. I was very young, I was merely 17, and I was surrounded by devotees who had been on the path for longer than I'd been alive, which is just a trend in my life. And there I was, and everyone was asking him questions of very, serious spiritual merit, and also some, various qualities of questions, frankly. And I felt this deep yearning. I really wanted to ask him this one question because I felt that it would be very important in my life. But that every moment there was a lull in the conversation, and he said, is there any other questions? And I'd begin to inhale. There was a gentleman sitting to my left who had no understanding of self-consciousness, and he would instantaneously ask a question. And it was fascinating for me because I was sitting probably just a mere 3 feet away from Swamiji. He could have reached out and touched me on the knee. We were so close together. And I really burned with this desire to ask, but every time I tried, the man next to me asked a question first. And Swamiji was starting to become very tired, advanced as he was in years at the time. And he kind of heaved a sigh after answering one more question, and he said, "Well, I'm becoming very tired, but I'll answer one more question." And I thought, this is it, this is my opportunity, and I inhaled, and the gentleman next to me asked another question. And Swamiji talked and answered him, and then he said, "Well, I'm getting very tired, but is there any other questions?" And I said, and he asked another one. And then finally, after that one concluded, Swamiji looked right at me, and he said, "Are there any other questions?" And I said, "Yes." And the quiet fell, and everyone looked at the newcomer. No, and I said, "Sir, I'm an actor, I'm an artist, and I don't always get to choose what role I play, but I would like to be a blessing to the audience. How can I bless them regardless of the role? Sometimes I play villains, sometimes I play heroes, sometimes the playwright is of noble mind, and sometimes, frankly, they're really not. So how can I be of service no matter what position I'm in?" And he gave me a very simple piece of advice, which has actually become really one of the guiding lights of my life. And he said simply, if you can feel the joy of God flowing through you, you'll bless everyone who sees you, no matter what role you play. And now, of course, at first, I thought he was talking about acting. And it took me quite a number of years to realize he was just talking about life. But now, what was very interesting was in my pursuit of self-expansion and of greater joy, which is really the inherent yearning of all of our souls, I was pursuing excellence. I was pursuing the experience of being in service to art or developing skill, and all those things were wonderful. And I could talk at length about the benefits upon the ego that art would have upon all of us. But what was very interesting was that simple question was the doorway to ego transcendence for me. And that the ego actually then, because of the golden carrot that Swamiji dangled out before me, became my friend. Because would you like to feel the joy of God flowing through you? Yeah. And so that motivated me to continually ask the question, well, where is that joy? How can I feel that joy? And what was interesting was for the next number of years, I had to confess, I did not feel that joy. I played parts, I played them well. I developed great skill as an actor and insight into the craft. I developed proficiency and even a good reputation. I began to work professionally. And I was taught and trained and developed a method by which to introspect and reflect upon the quality of my work and to be able to self-assess and improve. And I became very sophisticated in my art. And because of that, I developed skill. But it was interesting that no matter what, I would always ask myself one simple question at the conclusion of any work that I completed in the arts. Did I feel the joy of God moving through me? And if I could not, then I would have to admit to myself that I had not yet succeeded. I might have given and delivered a fantastic performance and won the accolades or won awards or whatever, but I had not yet succeeded because I knew that there was more. I was interested not just in success, but in true joy. And I was interested also in being a blessing to others. I didn't want to just succeed for my own sake, but I wanted to uplift the world. And I thought that my life would be rather empty if all I did was succeed for myself. And so it was interesting that although my trajectory as an artist grew and my skill, capacity, and potential for professional success, I felt it valueless because it was not giving me what I was looking for. Because the altar upon which I was offering my ego was greater than what I had yet accomplished. And so it was very interesting that perpetually I kept trying to ask, where is that spark of divine joy? And that even though I might have developed success, it felt as a cage to me. And I prayed and I yearned and I asked God, how can I overcome this? How can I finally unleash the blessings upon the world that I wish God would give through me? And what was very interesting was at the very end, right as I began to leave the craft of acting, because I did, as obviously, my life is testimony to, at the very end, when I began to recognize that my dharma was not necessarily to be an artist, but rather to be a willing representative and channel and devoted son of this path, my life began to change. And it was very interesting that the reason that I understood that, I'll just have to give this side tangent, was because I was invited to share some of the great blessings which I have inherited from Swami Kriyananda, from our master Yogananda. And I discovered that in the act of so doing, I felt a tremendous, thrilling joy. And I recognized immediately at the conclusion of that first attempt that in that act I had felt more of the joy that Swamiji had promised to me than I had ever felt in any of the acting that I had ever done, and any of the music that I had ever done. And I recognized, therefore, that the carrot was drawing me in a different direction. It was drawing me in a direction of greater ego sacrifice and self-expansion. But now what's very interesting, because I just want to put this last little plug in here, what was very interesting was there was a brief transitional time when I recognized that my dharma and that God was drawing me overtly in a slightly different path, but I continued my work as an actor for just like 6 weeks or so. And in that last period of 6 weeks, I had the pleasure of playing Macbeth. And if you don't know that play, Macbeth is one of the most fascinating characters, I think, in Shakespeare's canon, because basically his is a terrible fall. He begins the story as perhaps one of the noblest warriors, a great kshatriya, and he ends a wreck, a shadow, a twisted version of what he once was. And he enacts all of that upon himself by murdering his own king, his best friend, a man who he basically reveres as a saint. It's actually quite dark. And I was performing this part of the scene where he murders the king and this saint, his best friend, and basically unleashes hell upon the world and has to grapple with the fact that he's betrayed everything that he holds dear. Really light stuff. And something in which you might expect, of course, to feel the joy of God. Yay! And I was sitting there and just enjoying the irony. I was backstage and I thought, oh my God, I've decided to dedicate my life to being a channel of light into this world, and I'm about to go out and pretend that I've just murdered the most saintly man that I know. And that irony was very enjoyable. And I recognized that there was no way that I could play that part and simultaneously offer myself at the altar of my highest aspirations. Because how could I try and get into the consciousness of a murderer and of a betrayer, and yet also try and be an instrument and a channel for goodness and grace and beauty and divinity? It's just too far apart. And so I did the only thing that I could think of, and my entire preparation for walking out on stage was I sort of chuckled to myself and I said, all right, sir, meaning to God, to Yogananda, to my guru, I said, you're just going to have to play this part through me. And I walked out on stage and, oh, will all of the oceans wash this blood from my hands? We had a great time. And you know what was amazing was I think that was one of the best performances I ever gave. And all of my friends afterwards said, like, wow, you really brought the house down with that one. Like, it was so heartrending. And what was interesting to me was two things happened simultaneously in that experience. One, I felt the grief, the tragedy, the woe, the heartbreak of that character more deeply than I ever had before. I wept as I imagined the terrors and the horrors which I, as him, had committed. And yet simultaneously, there was a little part of my consciousness which was in joy, because it could recognize that all of that experience was not me, but was God flowing through me. And in a sense, there was a part of me that got to marvel and say, wow, sir, you are doing a very, very good job at being this murderer. Because it didn't feel like it was me. I felt like Yogananda came and said, all right, son, I got this one. Let me show you how it's done. And he stepped in and he gave a great performance, and I got to be there, and it was great. And so there was a really wonderful irony that the best work I ever did as an actor was when I no longer cared about being an actor. That the best work that I ever did was when I didn't do it after all. And I think that's the secret to ego transcendence. Is we all have to find that little way, that little golden carrot that will help us realize that really all we're trying to do is get out of the way. And of course, that's more or less challenging depending on our lives and our circumstances and our present state of awareness. But really, to try and boil this back to something simple. What if this is just the process of trying to leave behind our failures and accomplishments, that we might step forward into what God has in store for us today. Just ask yourself, what sort of saint was I born to be? How does God want to play through me today? How does he want to sing through me today? How does he want to smile through me today? And just imagine how wonderful your world could be if you were just one step closer to that saintly version of yourself. If you could just feel a little bit more of God's mirth, even as you walk through the tragic moments of your life. Because maybe that's one of the great indicators of ego transcendence, is that we're able to enjoy with equanimity the blows and the blessings that come into life. I have a dear friend of mine who I dare say possesses some greatness in his heart, because whenever ill befalls him, I have never seen him react save for in laughter. What a saintly quality, actually. And I think all of us can take a little leaf out of his consciousness. Let's try to be a little impersonal about ourselves. Let's remember that we are all, as Shakespeare said, this world's a stage, and the men and women upon it merely players. You have a part to play. You have a role to play. As Swami Kriyananda said, each one of our egos is just an act or an event for which we are responsible. It's not actually who you are. Your ego is not yourself, but it's just that what the soul has become identified with. That the 6-year-old is identified with being in first grade, but that must die in place of becoming a second grader. So you are right now yourself, your personality, but that too shall die. And what shall take its place? Well, my friends, I pray that it is greater joy, greater self-expansion, greater awareness of God's presence, and a greater hope for yourselves and a greater hope for each one of us, that we all can rise together to become more and more like the masters, more and more like our true soul potential. God bless you all, and I hope you all have a wonderful week.
Let's take a moment. Let this message sink in deeply. Some music.
I've known them forever, they've haunted my slumber and called to me out of the deeps of space. The love that they promise has helped me remember another time a caring embrace. Silence
Son.